The trick to wearing a secret in a room full of people who believe they already know your tragedy is this. You let them. You stand still inside their story of you. You accept the gentle hand on your arm, the practiced tilt of sympathy in someone's head, the way a woman like Constance Whitmore Bell can lower her voice by exactly one register and still be heard by half the table. You accept the soft eyes, the careful steering away from conversations about schools, about pediatricians, about the Castellano family's new twins born in September, a boy and a girl, announced on a card printed on heavyweight cream stock and mailed to everyone who mattered, which included you, because you matter in these circles in every way except the one that the circles have quietly decided is the most fundamental. You accept all of it with a smile composed enough to be mistaken for grace. You hold your wine glass lightly, 2 fingers, the kind of hold that suggests you might set it down at any moment and not think about it again. And you stand inside the story they have written for you, and you say nothing to correct it, because the correction would cost more than the silence, and you have always been a woman who understands the economy of truth. You have always known what things are worth. Eleanor Voss had been doing this for 10 years. She stood now at the edge of the Frick Collection's garden court, the Meridian Foundation's annual gala arranged around her with its usual precision, white orchids on every available surface, cascading from tall crystal vessels in a way that suggested abundance without excess, which was the precise aesthetic register this crowd occupied and policed. A string quartet in the far corner performed something that felt like Arvo part, but wasn't, close enough for the room's purposes, close enough for people who wanted the feeling of culture without the demand of it. 200 guests moved through the space in the particular uniform of Manhattan philanthropy. Subdued color, excellent tailoring, a kind of studied understatement that required a great deal of money to achieve and was meant to signal that money was beside the point, which was the most expensive signal of all. Eleanor wore a dress the color of deep water, midnight blue, falling simply, no ornamentation except the cut, a dress that a certain kind of woman wears when she wants to be seen without being looked at. Her husband had once called it beautiful years ago, at an event very like this one, leaning close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath and the sincerity in his voice, which had been, and she had always given him this genuine. Daniel's admiration, in the early years, had been genuine. Most things about him, in the early years, had been. Now he simply did not mention the dress. He did not mention many things. This was its own kind of statement, the kind that lived in omission, that neither of them had developed language for, or perhaps more accurately, that both of them had chosen, with quiet and mutual and unspoken agreement, not to develop language for, because language would have required honesty, and honesty, in the architecture of their marriage, had become a room that neither of them was sure they were ready to enter. She was 41 years old. She had excellent posture. She had learned, over a decade inside this world, the charity galas and political fundraisers, the quiet dinners in restaurants where the tables were spaced for privacy and the menus had no prices, the summer gatherings in East Hampton and the winter weekends in Aspen and the long, internally exhausting performance of being Eleanor Voss, wife of Daniel Voss, woman of the Meridian Foundation Steering Committee, woman of the Bellows Foundation's executive directorship, woman of this apartment. And that dress and this particular careful smile. She had learned that composure is its own form of power, that the people in this room, brilliant and connected and consequential as they were, mistook stillness for emptiness and would therefore always underestimate her. She did not mind being underestimated. It had, over 10 years, become something close to a strategy. "You look wonderful," said Priya Anand, appearing at Eleanor's side with the seamless efficiency of someone who had attended 300 of these events and developed an almost military capacity for circulation. Priya ran communications for Senator Hargrove's re-election campaign, a sharp, warm, entirely surface-level woman whom Eleanor neither disliked nor trusted, which described a significant portion of her social world and which she had made her peace with long ago. Daniel must be thrilled with the turnout. I counted at least 4 people from the governor's office. "Daniel is thrilled with most things tonight," Eleanor said, and allowed a small smile, and let that be enough. Across the room, her husband stood at the center of a loose constellation of men, Two real estate developers whose names she knew by reputation and whose handshakes she had endured at a dozen events. A former deputy mayor who had the comfortable ease of a man whose power was historical and therefore uncontestable, and a fourth man whose exact profession was never precisely stated, but who appeared at these gatherings consistently enough that his presence had become its own form of credential. Daniel Voss, at 45, had the physical confidence of someone told since childhood that rooms belonged to him, and the slightly overcalibrated warmth of a man who had only recently begun to believe he might want them to. He was tall. He listened well, or appeared to. Another skill she had watched him develop, the practiced forward lean, the nod that said, "I hear you," in a language that rooms like this one found irresistible. He was preparing to announce his candidacy for the United States Senate in 4 months. He had not formally told Eleanor this. She had known for 14 months, which was 11 months longer than his campaign manager had known, and considerably longer than his mother, who believed she was the first to know everything that mattered in her son's life, had known, because Eleanor had learned, over the course of 11 years of marriage, that the truest version of her husband existed in the quiet decisions he made in the interval between making them and telling anyone he'd made them. She had learned to read that interval. She had learned to inhabit it alongside him, invisibly, gathering information he did not know she had. She was very good at gathering information he did not know she had. She watched him laugh at something the former deputy mayor said. The laugh traveled across the room and reached her with the slight delay of distance, like light from a source that was farther away than it appeared. She observed it clinically for a moment, the openness of it, the genuine pleasure, and then she let herself simply receive it, simply be the woman across the room who still found something in her husband worth watching, because that was also true. It was possible for multiple things to be true simultaneously. This was something she had learned to hold. The laugh was real, she thought. That much still was real. "He's very good in a room," Priya offered. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "He always has been." The pause that followed had the quality of a conversational door, an opening Priya might have walked through if she were a different kind of woman, or if Eleanor had given any indication that the door was meant for her. She hadn't. Priya, to her credit, recognized a closed thing when she saw one, and excused herself with the smooth efficiency of someone who had other rooms to circulate through and would not waste time on a wall. Eleanor turned toward the garden court's arched windows. The November darkness had pressed itself flat against the glass, the courtyard beyond invisible, transformed into a mirror by the contrast of light and dark. In that mirror she could see herself, a woman in a deep blue dress, straight-backed, a glass held lightly in 2 fingers, slightly apart from everything and everyone in the room. She studied the reflection for a moment with the same detached attention she brought to new acquisitions at the foundation. "What is this? What is it actually saying?" And the reflection looked back at her and said nothing, which was, she thought, probably accurate. She stood in the overlap between the warm-lit room and her own faint image and thought about almost nothing at all. This was a skill she had developed with great intention, the ability to empty herself, briefly, in the middle of crowded spaces, to create a pocket of interior silence that looked, from the outside, exactly like a woman enjoying a quiet moment at a party. It was not silence inside. It was something more like the hum of an engine running at full capacity in a soundproofed room. Present, powerful, contained. She had been 31 when it started. The conversations about children had begun the way these conversations begin in marriages like theirs, not as demands but as assumptions, a future so self-evidently expected that it required no negotiation, only scheduling. Daniel had wanted 3. He had said this early, with the comfortable certainty of a man for whom wanting something and having it had never occupied separate categories for very long. His mother wanted grandchildren with the Voss name. This was stated less directly, but with greater force. Vivian Voss communicated most of her requirements through the architecture of what she didn't say, through silences shaped precisely enough to carry meaning, through the way she would mention other people's children at Sunday lunches, with the particular quality of casualness that was not casual at all. Eleanor had wanted children, too. She held onto this truth carefully, on difficult nights, when the revisionist pull was strong, when some interior voice tried to rewrite the story in a way that gave her more agency than she'd had, more foreknowledge, more design. She had wanted children. She had attended the first appointment at the fertility clinic on Fifth Avenue with genuine hope, genuine fear, genuine willingness to submit herself to whatever the process required. She had been 32. The clinic smelled of eucalyptus and money, and the specific anxiety of people who needed science to give them what life was withholding. She had sat in a waiting room with 4 other women and 1 other couple, and she had filled out a form, and she had gone into a room with a doctor who was kind in the particular professional way of people who deliver difficult information regularly and have learned to modulate their kindness accordingly. Daniel had not been there. He had a board meeting. He had sent flowers afterward, 2 dozen white peonies, her favorite, in the tall vase by the kitchen window, and a card in his handwriting, "I love you. We'll get there." She had put the peonies in the vase and stood looking at them for a long time. Even then, she had known something was misaligned. Not what, just that the picture had a seam in it somewhere, running from a point she couldn't locate, dividing the surface from whatever was underneath. She had not looked for the seam directly, because you do not, at 32. In a marriage you have chosen with full intention and still believe in, go looking for the seam. You hold the peonies. You attend the next appointment. You carry the story that is offered to you, that this is hard, that these things take time, that love is enough foundation for the patience required, because the alternative is a question you are not yet equipped to survive answering. She was equipped now. That was the difference between 32 and 41. The appointments had continued for 4 years. She would not give the 4 years to sentimentality, because sentimentality was a form of inaccuracy, and Eleanor was committed to accuracy even about the painful things. The 4 years had been what they were, a long, expensive, medically rigorous, emotionally exhausting process that had produced no result and had gradually shifted the atmosphere of their marriage in ways that were subtle enough to be deniable and pervasive enough to be undeniable. She had taken medications that made her body a foreign country. She had had procedures that required her to lie in clinical rooms and focus on the ceiling and breathe. She had gone to these rooms alone, mostly, because Daniel's schedule was always full, and she had not made an issue of this, because she had not wanted to be a woman who made issues of things, which was something she now understood differently than she had at the time. She had been protecting him from his own secret. Without knowing it, she had been, for 4 years of treatment and 6 years of aftermath, performing the labor of a lie she had never agreed to tell. She had sat with this fact for 14 months. She had turned it from every angle. She had considered whether the word betrayal was accurate, a word with weight, a word that required precision before deployment, and she had concluded, with the calm of someone who has moved past the acute phase of a wound and arrived at the diagnostic phase, that it was accurate, not melodramatic, not an overstatement, simply the right word for what had happened. He had known before their first appointment. She was certain of this now, with the layered certainty of someone who had assembled the evidence slowly, piece by piece, the way you restore a damaged painting, working under good light, with patience, without forcing the process. He had visited the clinic on East 72nd Street 32 months before their first shared fertility consultation. She had the date. She had the clinic name. She had, in the careful way she had been building her knowledge for 14 months, confirmed enough through channels she would not describe even to herself as investigation, because investigation implied an adversarial intent she was still, even now, not entirely sure she possessed, to know the shape of what had happened in that consultation room, and what had not happened afterward. He had walked out of that room. He had gone home. He had said nothing. And a year later, he had sat beside her in a waiting room that smelled of eucalyptus and money, and he had held her hand, and he had allowed her to become the answer to a question she had never been asked. The whispers had become, over the years, almost architectural, built into the spaces she moved through, load-bearing in their way. She heard the shape of them before the words arrived. A certain pause when she entered a conversation that had been, a moment before, about private school admissions. A careful steering of topics at dinner parties, someone noticing, too late, that the conversation had drifted toward pediatric allergists or summer camps or the logistics of traveling with small children, and correcting course with a brightness that was itself a form of the whisper. The way Genevieve Aldrich, who had 3 children and the specific social authority this conferred in these circles, always looked at Eleanor with that fractional softening around the eyes. Not pity, exactly, but its more expensive cousin. Compassion held at arm's length by people who are grateful not to need it. Eleanor and Daniel's situation. That was how it was referred to in the circles she had mapped over a decade of attendance. Their situation. The phrase had the quality of a closed door. Polite, final, asking not to be opened. She had never opened it for them. She had stood outside it sometimes, in the dark of very late nights, lying on her side of the bed while Daniel slept, or standing at the window of their apartment overlooking the park, the city's lights below her like a field of slow stars, and she had understood, with the precision she brought to everything, exactly what was on the other side of the door. She had simply not yet decided what to do when she opened it. The decision was coming. She could feel it the way you feel a weather change before the sky shows it. In the pressure, in the quality of the air, in some interior barometer that had been calibrated by whatever you have survived. She had been patient. She had been more patient than almost any other thing she had done in her life, and she had done many difficult things, with great patience. She had built the Bellows Foundation from a concept to an institution over 12 years. She had learned, in her 30s, to read Old Dutch in order to properly authenticate a provenance claim on a 17th century work that 3 other people had given up on. She had patience in the way that certain people have it, not as a virtue, but as a tool, deployed strategically, set down when the purpose was served. The purpose, now, was almost served. She lifted her wine glass, took one small sip, the Sancerre very cold, precise, a flavor like struck flint, and looked across the room at her husband, who was laughing again, who was alive with the energy of a man who believed his future was arriving, and she thought, quietly, without drama, for more weeks. It was 11:15 when Vivian found her. Vivian Voss moved through a gala, the way a cold front moves through a weather system, a shift in the air that preceded her arrival, people straightening almost imperceptibly without knowing why, conversations adjusting their register. She was 68, old money trim, the kind of slenderness that comes not from discipline so much as from constitutionally never having found food particularly interesting. She wore a charcoal Valentino suit that she had owned for 7 years and still wore with the authority of something purchased yesterday, and the emerald earrings that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother, a woman Eleanor had never met, who existed in family mythology as a figure of formidable character, deployed by Vivian at strategic moments as both precedent and standard. She found Eleanor by the bar with the accuracy of a woman who always knows precisely where the person she wants to assess is standing. "You've done something different with your hair," Vivian said, by way of greeting. It was not a compliment and not a criticism. It occupied the middle distance where Vivian conducted most of her commentary. Observations that required interpretation, carefully constructed to leave the recipient doing the labor of deciding what they meant. Eleanor had spent years studying this technique with the same attention she gave to understanding how a painting achieves its effect, not by accident, but through a series of precise, deliberate choices that create an outcome the viewer experiences as natural. "I haven't actually," Eleanor said pleasantly. Vivian's eyes moved over her with the brisk efficiency of a woman conducting an assessment she would not describe as an assessment. "You look tired. It's been a full week." "The foundation keeping you busy?" "The foundation and other things." A pause, fine as a surgical incision, placed with the same care. "I read the piece in the Times," Vivian said, "about the Harlem installation, the Children's Hospital." A nod, not quite approval, but the gesture that served as its placeholder in Vivian's emotional vocabulary. "That was handled well. Thank you, Vivian." Daniel was pleased. Delivered with a particular weight, as though Daniel's pleasure were both the destination toward which Eleanor's work traveled and the metric by which its value was confirmed. Vivian did not look away from Eleanor's face when she said it. She was watching, Eleanor understood, for something. A flicker, a tightening. Any evidence of the thing that Vivian had suspected for years and had never been able to locate, because Eleanor did not give things away that she had decided to keep. "I'm sure he was," Eleanor said, and gave her nothing. Vivian accepted a glass from a passing server. For a moment they stood side by side looking out at the room. Two women who understood each other precisely, and had never said so directly, who had conducted their 11-year relationship entirely in the register of what was not said, and Eleanor felt the familiar sensation of Vivian's presence, being read, assessed, filed, found adequate in some respects, found wanting in the one respect that, in Vivian's internal ordering of things, eclipsed the rest. "The Dunhams are expecting their third," Vivian said to the room. "Caroline looked remarkable tonight." "She did," Eleanor agreed. Vivian turned to look at her directly. And here was the thing about Vivian that Eleanor had spent years sitting with, turning over, trying to resolve into something simpler than it was. The woman was not, at her core, malicious. Eleanor had checked for malice the way she checked for forgery, carefully, without sentimentality, willing to find what was there. What she found, instead, was something that in some ways required more from her than malice would have. Genuine love for her son, genuine belief in the architecture of legacy she had built her life around, and a genuine blindness to what that belief cost everyone around her. Vivian did not see herself as a woman who caused harm. She saw herself as a woman who understood what mattered. "I worry about him," Vivian said, her voice dropping into its private register, the one Eleanor had heard perhaps a dozen times in 11 years. "The campaign will be examined. Every part of his life will be looked at by people whose profession is finding what doesn't hold together." She paused. "A family that appears complete presents differently. In the coverage, in the optics. You understand what I'm saying." "I understand exactly what you're saying," Eleanor said. Vivian looked at her for a long moment, searching, Eleanor knew, for something that was not there, or rather, for something that was there, but that Eleanor had spent a decade learning to hold below the visible surface, below the plane at which Vivian's considerable perceptiveness operated. Then something in Vivian settled, the slight closing of a door, and she set her glass down on the bar with a small, precise click and said, "He needs you to be well, Ellie. That's all I mean." "I know," Eleanor said. "Good," Vivian said, and excused herself, and moved back into the room, and Eleanor watched her go, and held the conversation's residue, and thought about the phrase "appears complete," and what it would mean to this woman, to this particular woman, with her emerald earrings, and her architectural certainty about what the Voss name required, when the thing that made the picture appear complete turned out to have been, all along, an illusion maintained at the expense of someone Vivian had never quite allowed herself to see as fully real. Eleanor thought about that for a while. Then she set her own glass down, and went to find her husband. In the car home, the city moved past the windows in its nighttime register, the park dark on their left, the lights of the buildings on the far side of it like a reflection of something, the streets below briefly empty in the way they are empty only very late or very early when the city pauses between performances. Daniel was quiet, the good quiet, the slightly empty quality of a man who has been fully present in a room for 4 hours and is now returning to himself, the performance set down, the private person resuming. Eleanor had always valued these drives home from events. They were some of the most honest time they spent together, the two of them in the back of the car, with the amber light from the windows moving across them, and no audience, and no requirement. He looked out at the park. She looked at him looking at it. "Good night," he said after a while. Not a question. A statement of assessment. He was processing it, filing it, calibrating for the next one. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her, and in the moving light, she could see the version of him she still found most true. Not the man in the room, not the future senator, not Vivian's son or the Voss name's custodian, but the particular man she had chosen in a seminar room at Columbia 20 years ago, who had argued with her for 40 minutes about institutional ethics with a rigor that was genuine, not performed, and who had then looked at her with a directness that was also genuine and said, "You're the most interesting person in this room. Can we get coffee?" She had said yes. She had meant it. She still, in some important sense, meant it. This was the thing that made the situation not a simple story. Nothing about this was simple. She had never wanted it to be simple. She wanted it to be true. And true things are rarely simple. And she had made her peace with this a long time ago. or was in the ongoing process of making her peace with it, which might be the same thing. "You were quiet tonight," he said. "I'm often quiet." Differently quiet. She looked at him. He was watching her with the uncertain expression, the compression of the brow, the careful searching of her eyes, and she held his gaze and gave him the true smile, the one that was still available to her without excavation, and said, "I'm fine, Daniel. I'm just tired." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded and looked back at the park, and she looked back at the park too, and they rode the rest of the way home in the honest quiet, the city moving past them, the park giving way to their block, the doorman appearing, the elevator, the apartment with its nighttime stillness and its view of the city spread below. And she had the thought, not for the first time, but with a new sharpness, that the view from this apartment was something she had loved for 10 years, and that love was not contingent on the rest of it, and that this was either a reassuring thought or a devastating one, and she was not yet sure which. She had found the document 14 months ago. She was precise about this. She told herself the story accurately, without revision, because the temptation to revise it, to make herself more knowing, more agentic, more in control of the sequence of events, was real, and she did not trust temptations that made her look better in her own telling. She had not gone looking. She had been in the study, in the lower drawer of Daniel's desk, retrieving insurance documents for Vivian's apartment. Administrative detail she was handling because Vivian had had a minor surgery, and because Eleanor handled these things, had always handled these things, the invisible management of their shared world that kept it functional, and that she had never questioned because it was what she was good at, and because she had believed, for a long time, that the people whose world she was managing knew the dimensions of what they were asking her to manage. The document had been in a manila envelope, misfiled, or not misfiled, she had later considered, perhaps simply placed where it had been placed, in the drawer of a man who did not believe his wife looked through his things, and who was correct about this, which was why she had been there for an entirely different reason. The return address was from a reproductive medicine clinic on the Upper East Side. She had been very still for a long time in that room. The study was a room she knew well, the shelves of books organized by a system, not hers, the desk with its particular smell of old wood and paper, the lamp that cast a warm pool of light across the surface, the framed photograph of the two of them on their honeymoon in Lisbon, on a terrace above the city, both of them squinting slightly into the sun and laughing at something she could no longer remember, which was its own kind of loss. She had stood in this room for a long time before she moved. Then she had taken the envelope to the window, because the light was better, and she had read the document inside with the care of someone who understands that documents, like artworks, require the right light and the right conditions, and who knows that what you find is determined partly by the quality of the attention you bring. She had read it twice. Then she had put it back, precisely as she had found it, angle, position, relationship to the other contents of the drawer, and she had left the study and gone to the kitchen and filled the kettle and stood watching it with complete attention while it came to boil, the way you focus on something small when something very large is moving through you and has not yet found a shape. She had made the tea. She had drunk it standing at the counter. She had washed the cup. She had dried it and placed it back in the cabinet. Then she had gone to bed, and she had lain in the dark on her side of the bed, and she had listened to her husband in the study at the end of the hall, the sound of papers, of his chair, of his particular presence in their home, which she knew as intimately as she knew her own breath, and she had thought, with a clarity that felt like cold water, I need to know more before I know what this is. That had been the beginning. The process of knowing more was not dramatic. This was something she had turned over many times in the subsequent 14 months. How entirely ordinary the mechanics of devastating discovery are. How undramatic a person can be in the middle of something that is, at its core, catastrophic. How the catastrophe requires you to keep doing ordinary things. Making tea, attending meetings, going to events, standing in rooms, with your wine glass held lightly between two fingers, accepting the tilted sympathy of women who believe they already know your tragedy. She had requested her own medical records from 3 separate physicians, framing each request as administrative consolidation. She had read them on a Thursday afternoon in her office at the Bellows Foundation, door closed, Annotations made nowhere but inside her own memory, which was reliable and left no trail. She had done research, clinical, specific, the kind of research that required her to learn a vocabulary she had never needed, a whole language of reproductive medicine that she had previously encountered only in waiting rooms and consultation summaries, delivered to her across a desk by doctors whose job was to translate the body's failures into manageable information. She had learned the word azoospermia. She had learned what it meant, the complete absence of sperm in the ejaculate. She had learned its causes, its implications, its different forms. She had learned that one of its forms, non-obstructive, genetic origin, was not a condition that developed over time or arrived without warning. It was a condition you were born with, a condition that a clinical test, conducted once, would identify, a condition that, once identified, could not be unknown. She had learned this on a Wednesday in October, 14 months ago, sitting at her desk with her hands flat on the surface and the afternoon light coming through the east window. And she had sat with the knowledge for a very long time. She had thought about the flowers on her kitchen windowsill years ago. She had thought about the waiting rooms. She had thought about the years of appointments she had attended, carrying the weight of what she had believed was their shared difficulty, their shared loss, their shared grief at a door that would not open. And she had understood, with the cold precision of someone reaching the end of a long authentication process, that she had been carrying it alone, that she had always been carrying it alone, that he had known this before their first appointment and had said nothing, and had continued saying nothing across the entire span of a decade, and had allowed her to become, quietly, thoroughly, at considerable cost to herself, the explanation for something that was never hers to explain. She had not confronted him. 14 months had passed, and she had not confronted him, and this was the thing she knew would be most difficult for anyone else to understand, which was one of the reasons she had not told anyone else. People expected confrontation. People expected that the moment of discovery leads directly, by the shortest route, to the scene of reckoning, the raised voices, the broken thing, the demand for accounting. This was how stories were expected to move, and she understood why. The reckoning scene offered catharsis. It offered the comfort of resolution, of conflict made visible and therefore available to be resolved. She was not interested in the comfort of resolution. She was interested in the truth, the full truth, not the first available layer of it. She had not confronted him because confrontation was the end of knowing, and she was not finished knowing. There were things she still needed to understand, not just what had happened, but why, and in what specific configuration of fear and ambition and the particular fragility of a man built on the foundation of legacy who had discovered, in a consultation room on the Upper East Side, that the legacy had a problem he had not anticipated and could not, in the moment, find any way to confess. She wanted to understand the architecture of his silence before she demolished it, because she had learned, over the course of a career spent understanding how things were made, that you could not responsibly dismantle something without first understanding what was holding it up. And there was another reason, a harder reason, the one she sat with most carefully on the morning walks through the ramble, in the cold, with the trees bare and the water visible and no one watching. She had not yet decided what she wanted, not what she was going to do, what she wanted. These were different questions, and she refused to collapse them, because collapsing them was the thing that people did when they were moving too fast toward a story they'd already decided to tell. And she was not that person. She had never been that person. She was the person who stood in front of a painting for 45 minutes before forming an opinion, because the opinion that arrived quickly was usually the opinion of your assumptions, not the opinion of what was actually in front of you. What was actually in front of her was a man she had loved for 20 years and still loved, in some form that had changed shape but had not broken, a marriage that was real in ways that the secret had not entirely contaminated, a life she had built, partly within that marriage and partly in spite of it, that had genuine substance, the foundation, the work, the art she placed in rooms where children who were very sick could look at something beautiful and be reminded that beauty was not contingent on being well, a future that was not yet written. And underneath all of it, the question she was circling. What did it mean that she had let the story continue? Not for a week, not for a month. For 14 months, she had known, and she had continued to stand in rooms with her wine glass held lightly between two fingers, and she had continued to accept the tilted sympathy, and she had continued to be Eleanor Voss, who could not have children, whose husband was patient with her about it, whose mother-in-law had been gracious enough not to press. She had let the story continue. This was the thing the morning walks kept returning her to, the question she kept turning over under the bare trees, in the cold, the city's sounds muffled and distant, and the park reminding her, as it always did, that certain things persisted independent of human arrangements. She had let the story continue. Why? To gather information. Yes, that was real and it was true. But also, she could feel the other truth beneath it, the harder one. There was something in holding a secret this large that had given her, for the first time in her marriage, an interior room that was entirely hers, a knowledge that no one could touch, a ground beneath her feet that was solid precisely because it was hidden. She was aware that this was complicated. She was aware that the word for it was complicated. She sat with it anyway, because the alternative, the simpler story, in which she was purely wronged and purely reactive, was not accurate, and she would not trade accuracy for comfort, even the comfort of moral clarity, for more weeks. She had given herself for more weeks. And then she was going to decide. Late that night, after the gala, after the drive home through the park, after Daniel had kissed her forehead in the hallway in the way that was both genuine and insufficient, and after she had heard him settle into the study and then, later, heard the light under the door go dark, she put on her coat and took the elevator down and walked east through the quiet streets to the Bellows Foundation's Curation Gallery on West 22nd. She had a key. She always had a key. The gallery was lit at its nighttime minimum, conservation lighting, low and amber, the kind of light that was there to protect the work rather than display it. She let herself in and stood for a moment in the entrance, in the quiet, the city's sound sealed away by the thick old walls, and she simply stood and breathed and let the room be what it was. She walked its length slowly, her coat still on, her steps quiet on the concrete floor, her reflection absent in the dark windows at the far end where the street outside was visible only as moving light. She moved past a large-format photograph she had acquired 3 years ago from a young artist from the Bronx, a woman in a kitchen, seen from behind, standing at a sink, the light coming from the window above her hands in a way that was less documentation than witnessing. Past a small oil study, mostly blue, of a bridge reflected in still water, doubled, one bridge real and one its own ghost. Past a set of drawings she was rotating in next month that she had not yet decided how to hang. Charcoal portraits, each face looking at something beyond the frame, each person absorbed in a seeing that the viewer could not share. She stopped in front of the photograph of the woman at the sink. She had stopped in front of this photograph many times. It was one of the pieces she had fought hardest to acquire. The artist had been reluctant, for reasons that were personal, and that Eleanor had respected without requiring them to be explained. And it was the piece she returned to most often when she came here late at night to think without thinking. There was something in the woman's posture, the slight forward tilt, the hands in the water she couldn't see, the light falling on the back of her neck, like a hand placed there gently, that Eleanor had never been able to fully explain, and had not tried to, because some things lost something in the explaining. She stood in front of it for a long time. Outside on 22nd Street, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping in a long arc across the gallery's high windows. The light moved through the room from the outside, entering at an angle, crossing the walls and the works and the floor, and reaching Eleanor where she stood. And for a moment, in that shifting light, every shadow in the room adjusted. The photographs changed. The paintings changed. The blue bridge study held its two bridges, and for a moment, in that moving light, it was impossible to tell which was the real one and which was the reflection. Then the car passed. The light moved on. The room settled back into its own amber quiet, and Eleanor Voss stood at the center of it in her coat with her hands at her sides, and she looked at the woman in the photograph, at the light on her hands, at the not knowing in her posture, at the way she stood inside her own life, without knowing she was being seen. And Eleanor thought about 4 weeks, and about what it cost to carry something this long, and about what it would cost to set it down, and about whether those two costs could ever be made to balance. She did not know the answer, But she was almost done looking for it. She stood in the low light with the weight of what she knew settled across her shoulders, like a coat she had been wearing for so long. She had stopped feeling its heaviness, and she looked at the woman at the sink, and the room hummed faintly around her, and somewhere outside the city continued its nighttime commerce, indifferent and enormous, and Eleanor Voss breathed in, and breathed out, and remained exactly where she was. Almost. End of part 1. If this story is sitting with you right now, if Eleanor's silence is saying something you recognize, then you are exactly who this channel is for. This is Acts of Hope with Zach. We tell stories about the weight people carry quietly, and what happens when they finally decide they've carried it long enough. Subscribe so you don't miss part 2. Because what Eleanor finds in those 4 weeks, what she decides, and what it costs her, is something I promise you are not expecting. Like this video. Leave me a comment. Tell me, did you suspect the truth? Or did it find you the same way it found her, quietly, in a room where the light was just good enough to see by? I'll see you in part 2.